said, and it's wonderful to be able to reach out to all of you in many, many different places. So tonight I'm going to talk about, I would say, one of my favorite topics. This is the topic that I began studying about 30 years ago, and really continues to affect my work because once you start with looking at original trials of the Inquisition, wherever it is, be it Portugal, Spain, or Italy, and I'll explain to you why it's in Italy, you sort of get a little bit hooked. You want to find out more about the people who were involved, their stories, because it's the stories of ordinary people, people who fell foul to a very, very tough Inquisition, what is a church court that really is very much part of the Catholic world in the early modern era. So, I'm going to be talking about the Italian Inquisition and Jews, but I don't mean crypto Jews, I mean professing Jews. I mean Jews who are openly living as Jews in Jewish communities, particularly in northern Italy, because the southern Italy at this time, the early modern period, is in the hands of the Spanish. We're really interested in what's going on in the north. And to many of you, this must seem a rather unusual combination. When you think of the Italian Inquisition, this is particularly what I'm showing you now is the place where you would go to find the inquisitional sources. This is the Palazzo del San Ufficio, the Palace of the Holy Inquisition in Rome. But when you think of the Inquisition, I'm sure most of you think about Spain. Spain, particularly, and Portugal. These were the places where the Inquisition was very brutal. In Portugal, particularly, it's very ferocious, and there's a black legend associated with the Inquisition and its very, very tough trials against crypto Jews, against witches, against heretics. And so, therefore, when we think about the Italian Inquisition, it's a little bit different. Anusim, also conversos in Spain as well, those Jews who practiced their Judaism in secret, or the slang term, of course, Marranos, as they are known, which actually probably means there's a lot of historical debate as to what it actually meant, but we think it means swine in Castilian, and of course the terrible burnings of the auto de fe, the acts of faith, that is, you see in this painting, which depicted this idea of what was an act of faith. It comes, of course, from St. John's Gospel, and the idea that you actually burn people who are unable to recommit themselves in sincerity to the Christian life. And I want to introduce you today to a different story of a Catholic Inquisition and its relationship with Jews, as I said, professing Jews, not secret Jews, but those who could live openly in Jewish communities. And I'm showing you one of the few courtrooms that still exists in Italy and gives us a sense of what the inquisitorial courtroom was like. It actually looks like a very beautiful room with all its exquisite paintings. And you see that it's really a place that a churchman and somebody who is under interrogation would sit. So definitely gives us not necessarily the sort of the toughness of the Spanish Inquisition, but something slightly different. And these Jews stood before what I want you to understand as being a different type of inquisitorial court in Italy, and whose intention was not to persecute Jews as much as to discipline them, to prosecute them for particular offenses and make sure that they knew their place in Christian society. And this, of course, is in an Italy that many of us have fallen in love with. I can say that definitely I have, as somebody who spends a lot of my time there. And I hope I will be able to show you how the Inquisition and its trials allow, instead of really necessarily being a place where Jews are terrified, but gives us a way of looking at how Jews interact with Christians by using the testimony of the inquisitorial trial, because it's not a place where Jews are terrified, as a way of understanding what life was like for Jews in early modern Italy, and particularly the 16th and the 17th century. So tonight, we're really going to put together these two parts of early modern Italian society. Professing Jews and the Italian Inquisition. And let me tell you that after 30 years, as I said before, of spending my research in the Italian inquisitorial archives, I actually started my doctorate in 1995. I'm delighted very much to share some of my findings with you. And I'm going to divide my time with you in the following way, as I write here. I'm going to begin with this sort of preliminary discussion about the Inquisition, its treatment of Jews, and the extant sources that are available for research. Why am I saying extant sources? Because those of you who know anything about Italy, especially at the end of the 18th century, where Napoleon walks into Italy, walks through Italy really, and really actually sort of cancels, gets rid of a lot of the archives, that we've lost a lot of potential trials that should have been even available to us today because of that movement of Napoleon through Italy. And then my second part of the lecture, I'm going to concentrate on the voices of the Jews who were brought before these courts in northern Italy and what their voice is, because, you know, when you're looking at a trial, you have to be able to decode it. They're still standing in before a judge. They're still trying to prove themselves and to have a certain appeal, certain way of thinking, certain way of telling their stories, because they're doing it obviously to protect themselves and their loved ones. And so therefore they're going to tell us about their lives and also about their loves, because one particular trial, as I will show you, shows a relationship between a young Jewish woman and her Christian admirer, who she meets when she's standing at the window. And we know this because of the inquisitorial trials. And it was difficult to choose what I wanted to share with you, but I'm going to really show you four aspects of Jewish life in early modern Italy through these trials. First of all, the Jewish household and the role of Christian servants actually in that household, because we know from the trials against wealthy Jews in Italy who could afford to have Christian servants, in particular wet nurses, because the mothers of these children really didn't want to spend the time nursing their own children, so they would use Christians who they would bring into their house, and we know this because of the trials, where the Inquisition was concerned at how a Jew was superior to a Christian. A Christian can never ever be underneath a Jew. So a Jewish household that had Christian servants or Christian wet nurses needed to be stopped. That situation had to be stopped. And so that's why we know about this. Second of all, as I mentioned before, a Jewess's illicit flirtation and relationship with a young Christian, all conducted actually from the balcony of her home. What happened to her Christian admirer, and more importantly, her father, Viviano Sanguinetti. And Ari mentioned that name at the beginning. He is from the Sanguinetti family. He's very distressed that his daughter is actually having some sort of, I would say, flirtation, not necessarily more than that, because she's standing at her balcony. A young Jewish woman in early modern Italy wouldn't necessarily leave the household very often. It was a dangerous place out there. So this is an interesting sort of point of contact between her and the Christian that makes us obviously think about Romeo and Juliet, and maybe also Jessica, we'll talk a little bit more about her, and Shylock in the Merchant of Venice. So that's the first two things. Then I want to introduce you to something else that I've been working on. I would say this is a book, as Ari mentioned, that I finished in 2024, which is how do Jews relate to the amount of Christian art that they are exposed to in Italy. How does that feel when you see the most beautiful church on every corner, and you see Christian images and crucifixes all around you. How did they cope with that? And that's also can be found in the inquisitorial trials because Jews get themselves into trouble. Sometimes they urinate on statues, sometimes they kick them, sometimes they spit on them, and then they come before the Inquisition because they're doing damage to those images. And lastly, of course, if we have time, I wanted to show you something fascinating, which is some form of exorcism in which the Jew plays a role in being able to exorcise a Christian woman who seems to be, I would say, overcome by some sort of devil within her. So let's start from the outside. Let's start from the Inquisition. So it is the 16th century, and Western Europe is facing one of its most dramatic centuries in the history of religion. After centuries of absolute Catholic power in Rome, of decadent popes, think of the Borgias, the papacy as a corrupt institution is forced to really, I would say, rethink its power and its existence because of one man, Martin Luther and his Reformation. He, of course, proclaims a new faith, and he manages to cause a massive response among the German people in his favor. Of course, it starts around 1517, and this is where you can see one of his cells where he's really thinking about how to make a Christian religion that anybody can be involved in. And it doesn't have to be elitist. It doesn't have to be through a priest. It can be something, a religion of faith in which everybody is involved. And it starts, as I said, in 1517, and soon it spreads through other leaders to France with Calvin, and of course to Switzerland with Zwingli. And the papacy, as you can sense, is threatened and needs to respond. And although nowadays we don't really use the term counter-reformation anymore, the main comeback that interests us here is the papacy's strive to preserve Catholicism from the contagion, as it's seen, of Protestantism by using a repressive mechanism of this newly established Inquisition. And we should define then the Inquisition as a papal court. Now, it's established much later in Italy than it was in Spain and Portugal. And I argue in my work that I think that when the Inquisition was being established in Italy, it was trying to do things that hadn't happened in Spain and Portugal. It wasn't interested in converting Jews into Christians and then making them not being able to really become genuine Christians. It has Jewish communities in Italy. So let's use the Inquisition in a different way. This is not about checking the true identity of crypto-Jews. This is not what happens in Italy. We have holy offices that are spread through Italy, and their inquisitors have to have constant contact with 6 papal cardinals of the Sacred Congregation of the Holy Office. This painting, of course, reminds us that this is not just going to be about professing Jews. It's about anybody who in some ways is dangerous to the Catholic religion. And of course, Galileo Galilei, for all his theories about that the earth, of course, was not flat and things like that, he is somebody who is seen as heretic. And in this painting, we very much see him standing before the Holy Office. Cardinals, and there were 6 of them in charge in Rome, they send out orders and demands for regular updates as to what the different tribunals that are spread throughout northern Italy are doing And you can sit in the archives and really study these letters of communication between the inquisitors. Let me just remind you also that it is the Dominicans who are the inquisitors. They are chosen to be the heads. They are obviously taking very, very active part in all of the universities in Europe. They really are the first lecturers, and they are the ones who study canon law and understand the importance of having I would say, an almost sort of an academic idea as to how to ensure that if you're having an inquisition, it is done according to a specific type of law. And in general, inquisitors come from the Dominican order. These highly skilled communicators, remember, not only dominated the Inquisitions, but also, as I said, the medieval European universities. And in 1542, Pope Paul III, that you see here, through his papal bull, through his pronouncement, and it is called Licet ab initio, we give to them, the inquisitors, the power to search those who leave the way of God and the true Catholic faith. And this is always the way that a papal bull works. The first three words at the beginning of that bull gives it the name. So we have Licet ab initio. This bull creates a new inquisition. Now, why? Why does it happen in the mid-century? Well, originally, the Pope is nervous because Protestants from Germany are infiltrating inside Italy, and there was a strong feeling from the papacy that the church has to discipline Italian society to prevent the heresy of Protestantism from endangering Catholic society. And let us just remember what Italy looks like at this time. It really is no more than a geographic expression. That is, as we see here, it is not a united country like it is today, right? We have very many different parts of Italy, northern Italy, different duchies. We have the Republic of Venice. We have the Duchy of Modena, where you have the ducal house of d'Este. We have other places as well. We have the Duchy of Milan. And it wasn't united politically during the period that we are speaking about. And one has to stress the extent to which it constituted a distinct cultural unit of different principalities. Some parts, of course, were united politically with powers outside of Italy, some of southern Italy, of course, with Spain, and some of northern Italy with Germany. And Italians of this period very frequently think of themselves primarily as citizens of one or another state or republic. They see themselves as Florentines, or they see themselves as Romans because they're in the papal state, or they see themselves, of course, as Venetians. And as I mentioned before, as you can see here, the southern part of the boot is called the Kingdom of Naples. It is under the control of the Spanish at this time, and therefore has its own Inquisition, which is part of the Spanish Inquisition as well. But let us return to our story. Here is a list of places in northern Italy where you had a local office of the Italian Inquisition. And each holy officer had really, I would say, these four officials who run the Inquisition. You have, of course, the Inquisitor General, as he was called. You had a vicario, who would work really for the Inquisitor, do a lot of the administrative work. The notary, who writes down, and I really see as responsible for ruining my eyesight, because sometimes it's so hard to read the handwriting, of course, of the notary. Interestingly enough, the questions are always in Latin of the Inquisitor, but the answers of the witness or the suspect or the person who's denouncing somebody else are always done in the local dialect in which the person has spoken. So there's always two languages that you have to contemplate when you're looking at these inquisitorial documents. And you also have a messenger who basically, works with the local sbirri, with the local police, to bring the person who's being investigated into the inquisitorial courtroom. And sometimes these tribunals had a full-time fiscal administrator helping to prosecute, and a formal congregation of theologians, local theologians. They could be priests, they could be sometimes other Dominicans or Franciscans who are called in to help give judgment at the end of a trial. So welcome to the Inquisition in Italy, a new court in the 16th century that saw itself as a disciplinary one in Catholic society. So where are the Jews, the professing Jews, in all of this? Well, they are living relatively comfortably in northern Italy. And at the beginning, Jews really hoped that they would remain immune to the Inquisition. They probably heard from their fellow Jews living in Spain and Portugal. Some of them had been expelled in 1492. They know that the Inquisition is not a good sounding word. They had that experience from family members or others who they met who had escaped Spain in 1492, and if not before. But what happens in 1581 is this huge watershed moment in terms of Jews and Inquisition. Because Pope Gregory XIII, who is ruling at this time, really decides that he thinks that even though the Inquisition has been set up to deal with heresy, really we could use the Inquisition, he says, to monitor the type of contact these professing Jews who live in Italy have with non-Jews. And in 1581, I would call him a particularly anti-Judaic pope, Pope Gregory XIII that you see here. This Catholic institution of the Inquisition adjusts its jurisdiction and allows itself to start prosecuting professing Jews, those Jews who are living openly in Jewish communities in northern Italy. Let me just reiterate that I'm not talking here about crypto-Jews or Marranos, Jews who in Italy are undecided, of course, and some of them do come to Italy, they're undecided if they're Jewish or Christian. I'm talking specifically about professing Jews. And Pope Gregory XIII, in this bull, again, Antiqua Iodorum Improbitas, the ancient wickedness of the Jews, again, the first three words of this papal bull, he authorizes, he expands his authority, and he says, now I am a pope, and I have a right not only to practice secret Jews, that means Jews who've converted to Christianity but carry on practicing in secret, that had happened in Spain and Portugal, but professing Jews, because I'm going to admit that it's likely that these Jewish communities will remain in Italy for a long period of time. They're useful. Not only are they moneylenders, but they're successful merchants. And therefore, the Inquisition as a church court should be in charge of them. And this bull clarified not only that the Inquisition was able to prosecute Jews for certain offenses, but it had the right to bring about corporal punishments or even harsher punishments of Jews. And this is a quotation from that papal bull. Wherefore, we, wishing to ensure that the purity of our Catholic faith is not defiled, nor the names of Christ and Christians mocked with impunity, have decided and declare that inquisitors of this heretical depravity have the power to proceed freely in all causes and cases as follows. And look here, we have a list of offenses, potential offenses that Jews might commit, in which case the Inquisition had the right to intervene and stop the Jew doing something against Christianity. Okay, so this really, I think, is a fascinating moment to think that the Inquisition can now monitor the type of interaction between Jews and Christians to the extent that until this moment it hadn't done. So here we have a list. I just see now that's number 7. I apologize. It should say sheltering heretics, not heltering. But you can see that these are crimes that Jews could do that would be offensive in some ways to Christians. And the content of the bull was actually not original, because since the Middle Ages, there had been a general belief among theologians that the papacy could punish Jews. But I think we should think about it in this way. What is new at this moment was the fact that papacy was actively encouraging its recently re-established holy office to directly prosecute practicing Jews for these particular offenses. So let's just move ahead a little bit. I want to show you that when we're thinking about the Jews, definitely from the 16th century, we also have to think about Jews living in some places in ghettos already. Now, I know that when I say ghettos, a lot of you will think very negatively about these institutions. My theory, and I would argue a lot of the theories of people looking today at Italian Jewish history, is that these ghettos were probably constructive in terms of keeping Judaism being practiced for many, many centuries. Because if you're living in Catholic Italy, if you have an ability to, in some ways, shut yourself up from outside society, and I think this picture does this really well. You see the ghetto in Venice, completely surrounded on its 4 sides with water, because obviously the canals, as many of you, I'm sure, have been there, know that instead of roads in the Venetian island, you have canals, and the Jews would pay porters and I would say doorkeepers to sit at these gates. There were gates on each side, as you could see, of the ghetto, and ensure that only Jews went in, and therefore the Jews had a form of protection. So 16th century, even though we have the Inquisition, we also have a sense that Jews are beginning to live in the ghettos. I would say, when the Inquisition is created in 1583, in 1581, there are only ghettos at this point in Venice, in Rome, in Florence, and here you can see the ghetto in Rome, the famous ghetto in Rome. We also have one in Florence. Unfortunately, it's not extant anymore. I think that's really one of the most disappointing things for me when I go to Florence. I want to see and understand the ghetto, but it's no longer there. There's nothing that remains of the ghetto in Florence, but we do have a sort of a more feel of it in Siena. But everywhere else have not yet created a ghetto. It hasn't been established. The papacy would like it to be established. They did it in 1555. They were following Venice. They thought the Venetians had got it completely right. If you're going to have Jews living in Italy, put them in a ghetto. The Jews, I would say, had come at this point to believe that the ghetto was a good thing for them. We see them describing it as our get. Now, get, of course, means divorce, but in many ways it was their divorce from the outside society, and they had the ability to concentrate themselves as a community. We see I would say, a blossoming of confraternities within these communities, and this really was a way of Jews, really, I think, staying together very, very long in terms of many centuries together. So I want to just, if I may, just mention a few things about the trials. Every single time that I read a trial, and you can see they are legible, sometimes you can really look at these trials and quickly understand what they're saying. I hope you can see my cursor here, my arrow. Respondit is the answer of whoever's being interrogated, and INT stands for interrogit, means the question. Respondit is the response. So you really get this sense of a very dramatic moment when you're looking at these notarial descriptions of these trials, that this is about a conversation, definitely a tense conversation, but something that is going on at the same time. Let me just jump on. I mean, I can show you how much inquisitorial material we have. You can see it here, all the many places where we still have inquisitorial sources, even though, as I mentioned earlier, Napoleon is responsible for destroying so much of it. We can really look at the different places, the different archives. We even have some that have reached, as you can see in number 2, Trinity College Dublin, that you can actually go there to look at some of the trials of the Jews in the Papal States, actually in Rome and around Ancona, that sort of area. And we have places as well, other places you can see, Ferrara, Pesaro, Savoy, we have Genoa. These are the places where we need to go if we want to look for the sources. And you can see in terms of primary sources of Jewish life, and also to hear the voices of the normal, ordinary Jews, really, this is a place to really understand what life was like. We need to decode them. We need to understand that there's a sense of pressure, a sense of tension. But once we've done that, we can begin to understand what Jewish life was like in early modern Italy. So I'm going to move ahead and I'm going to do my first thought about the Jewish household that I mentioned earlier. And I want to start with a fascinating case in Venice in 1571, when a Spanish visitor from Cordova, his name was Don Fernando de las Infantes, he comes before the Inquisition to report that a young black boy of about 14 wearing a yellow cap, and of course that's the color of the badge that Jews had to wear in Venice. At some point it moves from yellow to red, we're not quite sure when, and Professor Benjamin Rabvid has written an article, wonderful article, where he says just at one point the Jews are wearing a yellow hat, and then the next they're wearing a red hat. That happens sometimes in the 16th century. But what concerns the Inquisition is that the Jews are somehow having the presence of black slaves that serve them in the Inquisition. That serve them in the Jewish communities. That's not going to go well with the Inquisition. And the question is, what's going on? It seems to be that sometimes the Jews, and these are Jews who come possibly from the Levant or even from Spain and Portugal, bring their slaves with them. And this is, again, something that Ari might have said at the beginning. This is a topic that's particularly interesting to me at the moment. I'm part of a group of scholars who are trying to find the names of female slaves in the early modern period, and we can see a lot of black women who serve as slaves in the household of wealthier Jews, and they even end up in some ways sometimes having the children of these Jews, of these particularly wealthy Sephardi or Levantine Jews, and therefore we know that Jewish households often had these black servants. But we also find something else in these Jewish homes, and that is the use of a Christian woman to actually nurse the children of the Jews. This was an expansive position, particularly wealthy Jewish bankers, and we see the Sanguinetti again in Modena bringing in a Christian wet nurse, because the Jewish mother did not want to nurse the child herself. Why? Because she was a mistress of a household, because she was busy doing other things, she was running the household, possibly looking after other children. She didn't want to limit her time to nursing her child, and therefore the family comes before the Inquisition because the Inquisition is uncomfortable with the idea that a Christian, again, is serving a Jewish household. But what is interesting to me is how loyal these Christian wet nurses are to their Jewish masters. They're not only willing to be available, they're actually willing to move into the household and serve the Jews and be able to nurse the child whenever the Jews need them. And these Christian women would usually put their own babies out to other Christian wet nurses in order for them to be able to work for local Jews. Now, I hope you'll agree with me. I think that gives us a sense of how comfortable these Christians were, how also they want the economic benefit of being part of a household. They would be well fed. The Jews want to ensure that the wet nurse has a good diet, because diet is very much associated with the amount of the quality of the milk. And therefore we see again this fascinating interaction of the Christian woman coming into the Jewish household. But we also see Christians doing other things in the Jewish household. I know I'm showing you a painting of Vermeer. I love this painting. Obviously, it's a Dutch painting, but this idea also of what was known as a fogarole. It was a Christian woman who would come into the Jewish household in order to light the fires for Shabbat. And fogaroli is the name that was given to these women. They frequently served more than one master. They came in to make sure that the Jews had hot food for the Shabbat. They would have a fire. They would maintain the fire, make sure it could be kept going for the whole 25 hours of Shabbat. And their duties included preparing, clearing meals, sweeping the house, emptying chamber pots, making wine sometimes, under obviously the authority of the Jews themselves, washing dishes, and all of this information we have particularly from the inquisitorial trials. And here you have a list of what they do as well: making beds, sweeping the yard, clearing it of dung, of course, and carrying the groceries from the market to the house. We also see laundresses, and this is particularly in Simon de Sanguinetti's household in a place called Spilamberto. The Sanguinetti were a huge family, Ashkenazi Italian Jewish family in Modena, and they really had laundresses that would come into their homes, do the laundry for them. They used to stay for a few nights each month in order to do the whole household washing. But one thing I'd like to talk to you now is about this fascinating trial of a young Jewish woman. Her name was Miriam Sanguinetti, and she seems to have had an infatuation with a Christian beyond her balcony. The trial takes place in 1602. Mariana at this time is betrothed to her first cousin, but she conducts a flirtation with a Christian admirer. His name is Ludovico Mirandola, from her balcony. And unlike Venice and Rome, there is no ghetto in Modena at this time. It's 1602. The ghetto was only erected here in 1638. And here you can see the area in Modena where the ghetto was. So what we have actually in Modena regarding this case, and what is this case defined by the Inquisition? It means it is written that the offense is against Miriana's father. His name is Viviano Sanguinetti, and he is accused of dissuading his daughter from baptism. So let's just think about what this is saying. This is saying that the Inquisition finds out that Miriana is having some sort of illicit relationship with a Christian. She's obviously interested. She's tempted. She stands, let's think, here we can see, and I'm going to move forward here, she's standing on her balcony. This is what she does. And she's looking out, and of course, balconies in Italy are, everywhere. And very much, and I said this before, she's not a woman who's able to leave her household. She has to stand to see the outside world from her balcony. No Jewish father or any Jewish household in early modern Italy would let their daughter out of the house, certainly not alone. But I think from what I see from different testimonies, it was really quite unusual for a daughter to leave the house at all because of the danger possibly of being captured, of being kidnapped. There was just a sense that a woman was vulnerable and she needed to be kept inside her home in order to be prepared to be a woman and a mother and a mistress of another home. And so what you have in Italy at this time, as you can see, the windows, very important points for people to look out. Those of you who, again, have been to Venice know that on the outside of the ghetto, you couldn't, the windows were supposed to be shut. You weren't supposed to look out. And I think this was a reaction of the pre-interaction of Jews and Christians before this moment. So let's go, and I'm using, of course, the famous Juliet window, just to give us that sense of Miriana standing there. Let me say something about Miriana and Ludovico. So he is the one that goes to the Inquisition in 1602, and he says, look, I've fallen in love, or no, he doesn't even say that because he doesn't use those words, but he says, I'm tempted, and I feel that I need to tell you that in my mind, I did everything I could to try and ensure that this Jewish girl would convert, and then I would be able to marry her. Now, the Inquisition is going to be very interested in that. Wait a minute. This is something that they would like. They would like to have a wealthy Jewish, and I haven't mentioned that he's a banker, but his daughter, if somehow she would convert to Christianity, that would be a huge victory for the church. So it's interested. It wants to help Mirandola. It wants to understand who he is. Unfortunately, by the end of the trial, they see him as a completely useless person who has no morals and really sort of just gives up and doesn't try hard enough. But he goes out of his way to show at the beginning he had offered her rings, he says, and I tried to show you a ring of what would it look like in the early modern period. He said he wants to give her a ring with a strong Christian motive, and he does that. By the way, there's a sense to which Miriana isn't probably much older than 14 or 15 years old at this point, and she's just enjoying the moment of catching eye with this Christian who seems to be passing her house, and some of the Christian servants inside her household pass her messages and little gifts. So there's something going on, but I really never see it as something more than an infatuation. Viviano is the father. He's eventually brought before the Inquisition. He has to say, what's going on, and he has to admit to the Inquisition that he stops the relationship. He has to save his daughter. He says, before them, I suspected that my daughter had said she wanted to convert and be, of course, with Ludovico. I begged her and pressed her not to convert, but to persevere in the Jewish laws into which she was born. I told her to court only her intended. Remember, I said before that she was already supposed to be marrying her first cousin, to whom she was promised, and no other. And this was a tendency, I would say, in the early modern period of the very wealthy bankers in Italy of trying to ensure that their children would marry cousins, second cousins, because that way the money would stay within the household. So again, fascinating that we have this wonderful moment, and to really bring that home, in the Israel Museum has a wonderful collection of wedding rings. These are the wedding rings that Jews would wear in Italy. You can see not easy rings to do the washing up in, and you have the sense that these were rings that were lent for the wedding ceremony, because obviously they're very not easy to have on your hands, but gives us a sense to which the wedding ring is a very important thing against the rings that Mirandola is trying also to convince Miriana to convert to Christianity. Anyway, so we have this wonderful situation, definitely makes us think of everything that Jessica did to her father. And if those of you who are fans, as I am, of The Merchant of Venice and Shylock, and really how she disappoints him and leaves and marries her Christian lover, Lorenzo, what we have at the end of the trial in Modena against Viviano Sanguinetti is a father who has to pay a fine for dissuading his daughter, but he actually achieves what he wants. She's too frightened. She doesn't trust Ludovico, and she doesn't run off with him. Now, when I wrote about this trial, my theory, my conclusion was that I thought Miriana was a very, very clever woman. She said things in the trial like, I'm not sure I trust Ludovico. I'm worried that if I run off with him, he's going to take advantage of me and then he's going to leave me. And so what I wanted to, and what I sensed was that really was in awe of Miriana herself, that she understood that the Christian world was dangerous beyond her window, and therefore she was the one that stopped the relationship rather than her father, who definitely put her in a room for 3 days, locked her up, gave her bread and water. But I think at that point anyway, she decided that it wasn't a good thing for her to do, and she does what her father wants her to do, which is to marry her first cousin. So again, and I hope you'll agree with me, this is a wonderful moment of of getting to know our Jews. The other things, the other topics that these trials are really relevant for, and this I would say led me from my first book to my second book, is understanding, as I mentioned before, how Jews dealt with having images on their street corners. I felt like, you know, these images are not inviting images. In fact, they're sort of pressurizing images. You see Mary and Jesus, you see crucifixes. Can we have a sense of how Jews dealt with this? And that's exactly what happened. And this was not even finding a trial about a Jew who maybe spat or who I don't know, sort of was in some ways offensive to a Christian image. This was a trial against a neophyte who comes as somebody who converts, but he chooses to tell the Inquisition about how Jews deal with Christian images. And this again is a translation of his testimony, but it gives me the sense of what Jews uttered under their breath when they saw a Christian image. So this is Giacomo Grisoffi in 1605. He says the following. When they, and he's talking about the Jews of Modena, hear us singing the Ave Maria, and the Christians kneel on the ground, approaching one or the other, because every day, of course, in Catholic Italy, there comes a time when when Christians are expected to bend down and pray and say the Ave Maria. What do the Jews do? So he wants to tell the Inquisition what they do. The Jews say the words of that verse of David, Ipsi obligati sunt et sesiderunt, nos autem surreximus et erecti sumus, which, as the Jews understand it, means that those who kneel, the Christians, that means the Christians, are small, unlike those other Jews who stand on foot and are being raised in the grace of God. And then he says the words, and I hope you can see them at the bottom in Hebrew. He obviously doesn't, he just speaks them, and the Inquisitor just write them down. But if you look, you can see that they are the Jewish words. Chema ka'u v'naflu v'anachnu kamnu v'nit odal. And you have the sense that this is what Jews uttered whenever they saw a Christian image. We are not bending down to that image because we are standing up and we are raising ourselves in the grace of God. And I actually had a conversation a few years ago with one of these Rabbi Stams here in Israel, and he told me that he even today had learnt from his father that this was what Jews said whenever they came across a Christian image. And I found it fascinating that I saw that this was a practice that obviously had been going on for many centuries, and you see the Jews actually doing it here as well. So, as you can see, we are using these testimonies to really understand what Jewish life was like. And I'd very much like to finish with one trial from the archives in Venice. And this is the exorcism thing, the trial that I mentioned before. It's a fascinating case of a Sephardi Jew being called into the house of a Christian silk spinner to exorcise his goddaughter, who is believed to be possessed by spirits. It occurred in 1584, and we see a Christian neighbor who comes before the Inquisition, the Holy Office in Venice, to denounce a Christian spinner. When the spinner comes before the Inquisition, he is unable to name the two Jews who had carried out the exorcism, All he testifies is that he knows that they were Sephardi Jews and not Italian or Ashkenazi. And what he can supply are only the physical descriptions of what these Spanish Jews looked like. They were wearing turbans and had a black slave. And again, that fits in with what we saw earlier. Whether he does this to protect them must be suggested, meaning that Christians understood that if they had somebody whose body seemed to be taken over by spirits, the Jews were good people to help them with this particular situation. And for me, the trial confirms the Christians' belief that it is a Jew who can help them in this particular situation rather than a Christian priest. And let us just look at this exorcism prayer. Why? Because it has to be a prayer that is done in Italian, because the Jews can't just sort of proffer some Hebrew text. There is a sense to which they are saying something, they are being valuable to the Christian society, and they clearly believe that they have the power to do this. I exorcise you through the God of the Christians, and through the God of the Jews, and through the saints of the Christians, and through the saints of the Jews, to come outside the body. And here in the depth of exorcism, there is even a common prayer bringing Jews and Christians together to solve the situation. Again, what's interesting about this case is that the Inquisition can't find the Jews. It's not enough to say, well, they wear turbans, because many of the Jews who come from the Orient, who come from the Ottoman Empire, are wearing turbans in Venice. It's a very, very diverse society, so there's no way they're going to find them. But on the other hand, we see I would say, the dependence of the local Christians on Jews to be able to help them sort out this situation. And again, I think it's also pushing me towards a whole topic of magic, and I think that might be something that I'm thinking about doing in the future. But I love this sense that the Jews can provide some sort of power over the Christians, and the Christians realize that the Jews can provide this, and as I said before, not something from a Christian priest. Okay, I think this is a good point to conclude, if I may. What we have seen above all, and I hope you will agree, more than the disciplinary tactics of an early modern inquisitorial court, is a sort of local convivencia, a sort of a coexistence that's economic, that's social and religious, that I think goes a long way to explaining how well Jews fared for themselves in early modern Italy. That if they were given a chance to live in ghetto and sometimes pre-ghetto society, things worked well. Jews understood how they could use Christians. Christians understood how they could serve Jews, but also how you see this interaction, also some sort of flirtation even on occasions between the two. And perhaps even explain their longevity in Italy, that the Inquisition was clever enough to know that it was much better to create a court that could discipline Jews, but not make them terrified about the inquisitorial presence. Jews, of course, had lived in Italy from the 2nd century before the Common Era. The Jews of Rome see themselves as the oldest Jews of Italian society. And I think that this is something to consider. The Inquisition remained a disciplinary court rather than a persecutory one. And I think the difference is paramount, especially for me as a historian, to use these texts, because I think when you go to Spain or Portugal, you always have this sense that everybody's so terrified that they're going to be burned, that can you really get to the bottom of who is who and what they're doing and whether they did things or not. The Inquisition, of course, was finally outlawed in Italy in 1834, after the restoration of the Pope as the ruler of the Papal States in 1814. So the activity of the Papal States Inquisition actually continues until the mid-19th century. Notably, as I'm sure some of you know this most famous case of which the Inquisition was involved. This, of course, is the case of the kidnapping of Eduardo Montara that you see here, a little boy. He is now shown here as an adult. I would say this is, for me, one of the most fascinating cases. And if anybody is going to Italy, I really cannot recommend higher the book by David Kurtzer, which is called The Kidnapping of Eduardo Montara. He was a little boy. He is seen, you see him here, standing as an adult, as a Catholic priest with his hat in his hand. And he was taken from his Jewish family at the age of 6 years old. He was thought to have been baptized by his Christian servant. She had told the Inquisition that she was worried that he was going to die, and she felt out a duty to baptize him, which of course means nothing more than just putting some water on his head and saying a few Latin words. She said she had baptized him. The Inquisition felt it had an obligation to go into the household of the Mortara and to kidnap this little boy. And then afterwards, he grows up to be a Catholic priest. This is one of the very few, I would say, I think it's the only occasion he meets his mother and his brother. You can see them standing next to him. You can see from the way he's looking and the way his mother is looking that there is no relationship anymore. She hasn't seen him since he was 6, and he believes fully that he had a mission, that he was supposed to be taken by the Pope, that he was supposed to be taken by the Inquisition, and he becomes a Catholic priest. And he dies, I think, in the early 1940s. But in many ways, I think for me, this is the point to end. That after many years and after many trials and disciplining, this was the moment when the papacy tried desperately to say it was still in charge of Europe, even though it wasn't by this time. And this kidnapping of Eduardo Montara becomes one of the last moments of strength of the papacy in a very, I would say, dramatic 19th century when so much of the ghetto walls in Italy come down. So thank you so much for joining me. I really hope that I've given you some insight into how the Inquisition worked in Italy.
Thank you. If you have a little time, I had some questions to get to. If you have
Sure.
your questions, please feel free to email them, to chat them, and then we'll get to them as opposed to um, we don't have time to unmute people. So here are some questions that I think people have asked. I'll put them into a list, and then we'll go through them. How many trials were there? Were there a lot of these that you keep looking at, or are they only a few? Um,
Loads.
oh, and
Sorry. Yeah.
like, okay, yeah.
Many trials. Let me just go back, and I apologize for sort of doing it too fast. In terms of where I tried to list where all the places where these trials were, as you can see here, I mean, we've got, 13 trials in the Papal State, 30 trials in Siena, 25 in the State Archives in Venice. Some interesting documents on the Jews in the archives in Bologna, and then also we have in Ferrara some trials. So really, wherever we have trials in which professing Jews are found, then we go and see, or I go and see what I can find and what sort of accusation has been put against them.
And how did the trials end? Because you gave us the trials, but you didn't tell us what the
Yes,
outcomes
that's
were.
very true, very true. I was rushing a bit. So Viviano, I think I mentioned Viviano Sanguinetti, who is accused of dissuading his daughter from baptism. He has to pay a fine, and that's really, I would say, the way that most of the trials end. If the Jew is found guilty or found responsible, now again, he has to have two witnesses who see that he's guilty. If the Inquisition has two witnesses who will agree with the person denouncing the Jew, then it was usual for the Jew to be fined. Why fine? Because the Jews are wealthy. The Inquisition is in need of money. You never see the Jew really facing a death sentence. That doesn't happen in Italy. And I think, again, that changes the whole dynamics of the inquisitorial court. And it's therefore much, doesn't have, as I mentioned, often the drama of the Spanish and Portuguese. So I would say, sort of, if a Jew is found guilty, and again, you have to ensure that, then he will be made to pay a fine. Occasionally, you will see him whipped in a public square, but that's Doesn't happen too often. The Inquisition, if they know that the Jew has money, will choose to fine it rather than anything else. So it's a
And,
monetary
right.
punishment.
In your research, were the Jews found guilty in like a majority of these cases?
I would argue that what's so unbelievably fascinating about these cases is that the Inquisition is trying to be a fair court in an early modern world, meaning it wants evidence and it needs evidence and it relies on evidence. It will not accept a Christian's denunciation just because it comes from a Christian and is against a Jew. And that's, I think, again, very important. So that's something that to be considered every time you do feel that the Inquisition is trying to be fair and is not being influenced just by somebody who's denouncing a Jew.
Um, there's a question whether you have found any archives, Inquisition archives in Parma besides Modena. So that was a technical question, but I'm passing along to you.
You mean in where are we talking about? Parma in Sicily? What, where?
I don't know. The question was, are there any
Oh, Parma
Inquisition archives in Parma
Parma in the Papal
besides
States.
Modena? I
Not
assume in
particularly in Parma. No,
Parma,
not
Italy.
particularly there. No,
Okay. Um,
no.
was this unique to Italy then? Did any other Catholic countries do this?
I believe it is unique to Italy because any other place. Remember that the Portuguese is a strong Inquisition because it's in Portugal and also in Goa. The Spanish Inquisition is not just in Spain, but it's also in southern Italy. It's also in Sicily and Majorca and other places. So those are stronger, bigger Inquisitions. In Italy, the Inquisition is trying to do something different. It realizes, and it's over 50 years later than the Inquisitions in Spain and Portugal when they're established, and it's reflective of what the Inquisitions had become in these countries, in these lands. It doesn't want to be that sort of Inquisition. I would argue, and I think it's important, if you're looking at this Inquisition in Italy through the lens of heresy and witchcraft, you do have see the Inquisition definitely burning people, but again, with for me the fascinating aspect is the Jewish inquisitorial relationship. So I'm really looking at it through that lens,
But so
and I would say,
they were on a separate track prosecuting
yeah,
crypto Jews
Protestants
and
who came into yes.
burning people
But
just
not to it's not ferocious. It's really not as ferocious. Unless somebody's done something really bad, then it will, it will possibly decide on capital
right.
punishment, but not very often,
So
not to the same
right.
extent.
As opposed to Spain and Portugal, where technically there should not be any Jews. What this is showing is there were Jews in Italy, and this
Right.
is how they were interacting, and you're pulling the information about what Jewish life was like in this environment.
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
so I guess the question is, how many Jews are we talking about that in this time that were being like, what was the Jewish population like?
Well, again, I mean, it's not so easy to know. We only really know when Jews begin to be ghettoized. For example, we know that about 750 Jews enter the ghetto in Venice. Venice was the first ghetto in 1516. And then also we have a huge influx of Jews once they are expelled from Spain. And what's so fascinating in Italy is that the popes and the dukes all want Sephardi Jews to come and live in Italy. So you have a huge influx of Jews coming into Italy from, during the 16th and 17th century. And you actually see them invited in, and it almost becomes a competition because they're such good merchants. They have such amazing relationships with family members and business contacts in other places, maybe in the Ottoman Empire. So they're really versatile and valuable, and they contribute to all of these trading. Venice, in particular, the Republic of Venice is based on trade, and the whole New World is being opened up, and so they're really in demand. So you can't necessarily know for sure, but you just know that I would say, through the next 2 centuries, huge influx of Jews living in communities. And we know that even just by thinking about the Venetian ghetto. You have one ghetto that's created in 1516 where 750 come in. Later on, 1541, you have another ghetto that's created, which is for the Levantine Jews, the Jews who've come in from the Orient, from the Ottoman Empire. And then in 1589, you have a third ghetto that is created for the Sephardi Jews. So I think we're talking, I would say maybe as much as 100,000 people, Jews living in Italy at this time.
Very interesting. Um, just one or two more questions. There was a question
Mhm.
of why did Napoleon come in and wipe out the archives?
Because he comes into Europe, because he comes into Italy and he knocks down the ghettos and he's not careful about where he's going and he does a lot of destruction as he walks through Italy. And unfortunately, we see a lot of the archives were destroyed. It was an inevitable consequence of him walking into
So it
Italy.
wasn't intentional to destroy an archive. It
I
was
don't think it was
okay.
intentional, no. It was just the
Did you find any rabbinic response to these um, Jewish inquisitorial sessions where the
But that's
rabbis
a,
talked
that's a
about this?
wonderful question. We do have one description of Rabbi Hanina, who talks about his own experience before the Bolognese Inquisition. He describes in particular how he was tortured by the Inquisition and how if he said what they wanted, then they would put him down. He talks about what's known as the strappato, which is a particular type of torture where they put the hands behind his back and he's lifted up. So we have that description. But recently, there's also a wonderful description of the inquisitorial prisons that was recorded by a Jew who was caught by the Inquisition. His name was Benjamin El Natan. Now, his own diary has recently been translated by Professor Martina Mampieri, and she has written a translation of his diary, and he comes in and describes what his own experience was being brought to Rome and actually being imprisoned in the Holy Inquisition. So those are two wonderful sources
Okay.
written by Jews about the Inquisition
Well,
in Italy.
let's unshare the screen for your last question so people can see
Sure,
you. Um,
sure.
so you said you frequently go to Italy. So you get the
Yes.
opportunity to share. What is your favorite place to go? Where do you
My
like to go in
favorite place
Italy?
to go in
Yes.
Italy. So I can honestly say that my love of Italy was started in Venice. Can I say a non-Jewish place? Is that okay without offending anyone? There's a
Yes.
place in Italy called San Rocco. It's a little bit off sorry, in Venice. The Scuola Grande San Rocco. It's one of my favorite places because it has the most incredible paintings of the Old Testament. And what do I mean by the Scuola Grande? A Scuola Grande is like a trade union building. And in early modern Italy, these were all religious buildings because if you were part of a trade union, meaning you were, a guild, that's what trade union means. So everybody was divided into different guilds. If you were a Christian, if you were a hatter, or if you were a tailor, you had your own guild. So San Rocco is one of one of the most famous guild buildings in Venice, and the paintings on the walls of the Church of San Rocco, where these guild members used to pray, has really, I think, some of the most Tintoretti and wonderful paintings of the Old Testament, and highly recommend. And it's also a little bit off the beaten track, so you only go there if you know to go there. People don't, there's so many other things to see in Venice, so I really recommend it.
Okay. Well, thank you. We will put that on our Italy trip
With
agenda
pleasure.
and itinerary.
With pleasure.
Thank you so much for today's program, something that I'm sure most of us didn't know much about, but now know way more. And we'll follow up with some resources. Look forward to having you back with us
Thank
for
you.
future programs. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Have a great weekend. See you on Sunday. Take care, guys. Bye.